Thank you very much, Sean. I hope you have many more nephews and nieces that will encourage you to keep writing. You're very good to have been with us tonight. Congratulations. Now, as we move towards the final phase of our evening, we're reminded that we live in interesting times. We saw it, I think, in the video at the outset. And what a university like Trinity or an institute like the Long Room Hub seeks to do, its ambition is nothing less to shape the futures that we experience here on this island and maybe beyond as well. And at the core of that is this question of identity, something that our next two speakers are going to tease out in the course of their conversation. So would you please welcome to the stage Professor Pádraic Whyte, who in addition to being Associate Professor and Director of the Masters in Philosophy in Children's Literature here in Trinity, is involved in the Clandy Reading Party that we mentioned earlier, which in October will feature children's literature and culture. And I'll let him introduce his guest.
Thanks very much, Brian. Thank you for that. It's an honor and a pleasure to be up here with Rory O'Neill, which many of you will already know. He received an honorary doctorate from TCD in 2015 for his work in charity, for being a campaigner for equality and fairness for decades, for raising hundreds of thousands of euros for charity. But many of you will also know him as a writer, as an artist, as a performer. He performs as Panti Bliss in drag. And I think it's safe to say, though, that a lot of people will know you from your Nobel Call in 2014, it was, yeah?
Yes.
And that was what catapulted you into the global spotlight, I suppose?
Possibly. I'll just say that it might have been the highbrow Late Show to this point. Now it's the actual Late Show. Although I feel bad for Mark because he could have just come to me rather than writing a book, because I've already achieved singularity through drag. I already exist as an all-knowing mythical being.
So as Panti and doing the Nobel Call in 2014, why do you think that had such an impact at that point?
I mean, a number of reasons, timing and all of that, but I think what it did accidentally, I'm not taking credit for it because that wasn't planned, what it did was it allowed everyone else to understand my story, and my story is, refracts other people's stories. And I think what it did was it showed the power of the personal story, which is what everybody in the humanities and the arts is doing. We're telling stories in various ways and through various means, but we're all telling stories, somebody's story. And you can use that power for good, and you can use that power for bad. But I think it is arguably the greatest power that humans have, to be able to tell each other our stories. And it can be turned to bad, too, because sometimes the story people tell aren't true. If you look at America right now, apologies to any Trump supporters in the audience, but he got there by telling a story. It's a bullshit story, but it's one that got him to the most powerful job in the world. And I hope that the Nobel Call was, I told my own story, and it is a real story, but I hope it shows you that the power of that personal story is available to everyone if it's told right at the right time, and it can change society.
Yeah, and I think what was important was that to remember is that it wasn't just you telling your story. It was how you told that story in the first place, and that art and an artist's performance was central to that. I mean, you didn't go on stage after the Risen People and do that Nobel Call as Rory.
No, I didn't. And also, I think in the context of this, today, technology played a big role too. 10 years ago, the people in the audience would have seen it that night, and maybe Fintan O'Toole might have written a word or two about it. That'd be it. But YouTube, the internet, allowed me to reach a much greater audience.
So I think that was a turning point, I think, for a lot of people in terms of LGBT rights in Ireland as well. I mean, I don't know if you would see it that way yourself, but do you recognise how that transformed LGBT rights in Ireland?
I wouldn't want to play its role or anything, but I do think that, accidentally, it sparked a conversation. At that time, there was no referendum called. It was maybe in the ether, the idea of having one. But what it did was it sparked a conversation in general terms about how Ireland had treated its homosexual citizens in the past and how it was at that time. And it sort of aired out some dirty laundry in a way. And so it meant that when the referendum was called, like a year and a half later, we'd already had quite a deep conversation on a national level about the generalities. And so I think it allowed, relatively, the conversation around the referendum to stay focused on the actual issue, rather than careening out into all sorts of other issues that aren't on the paper, as has often happened before in other referenda.
Yeah, and I think, like you're saying, we did have opportunities to tell stories, and we were telling all these stories for a long time. That was part of it too, reminding people that this wasn't something new that we were telling people. We were going back to stories from the 1980s, from the 1970s, from the 1990s, and recognizing that your story within all of that was just yet another story. And I think that's what was important to remember too. By the time we got to the referendum campaign, there was a momentum there.
Yeah, and I would argue that both that referendum and the reproductive rights referendum were both won on the power of the personal story, because people, stepped forward and told their stories, whether they were known people or just regular folk, and they telling them at their offices or in their schools or whatever it was. And I think you could see then that in the following referendum, people had learned from that, and women came forward and telling their own personal stories in a way that they had never done before in the previous referenda on reproductive rights. And the thing is that people, the broad, intellectual discussions about things are important, of course, but they don't reach into people's gut. And when people are going in to vote on a single subject like that in a referendum, they vote with their gut. And it's only by getting to know people and their stories that you can empathize with them. And so it's very easy to hold prejudices or weird ideas about groups of people that you don't know, but it's almost impossible. I mean, it's at least very difficult to hold prejudices against people that you do know. Yeah. And you only get to know people by hearing their stories.
Well, that's it. And it was about marginalized voices coming to the fore, I suppose, and hearing those stories. So one of the questions we have is, if we're reflecting on what's happened over the last 10 years in Irish society, the achievements that are there, what are the national conversations that we need to be having? At one stage, it was taboo to talk about gay relationships. It was taboo to talk about abortion and reproductive rights. So what is it that we should be talking about now?
I mean, there's quite a few. Weirdly, I do a lot of work with the Department of Foreign Affairs. And so I do a lot of talking about queer issues, if you know what I mean, in other parts of the world, in places where now telling Ireland's story is of great benefit in other places, because, I think if you're talking to a 17-year-old lesbian in Sarajevo, and it's a really tough life for her, and then I come along and get to tell her, when I was 17, Ireland wasn't all that different, and I thought it would never change either, but, great change is possible. Here at home, well, take your pick, there's quite a few. Personally, I'm really enraged by the direct provision system, and I think it's a stain. I think it's a stain that we're going to be really ashamed of looking back in the future, in the same way that we look at Magdalene laundries now.
Yes. And I think that there, like you say, there's a list as long as your arm. I think that we could go into, but the important thing is that we start listening to these stories a bit more, because we have to safeguard a lot of those achievements that we have that have happened in Ireland over the last number of years. And I was reading an article in the Irish Times that the author Gavin McRae had written, who was a survivor of a homophobic attack in recent weeks. And it demonstrates that, this fight doesn't end. We have to be vigilant. But one of the things that struck me about what he was saying, and our thoughts go out to him, and we hope he has a speedy recovery, is that the thing that had changed from him from being a child was that people were now listening to his story. People were now listening to his experiences of homophobia and so on like never before. And maybe that's one of the key things that has changed in Irish society, because through the 2 referendum that we had, there was, I think we could conclude that we are a compassionate people more broadly, and maybe that comes from listening to those stories, not just hearing them, because they are out there, but we have to listen carefully to them.
I think we are compassionate people at heart, and I think we do, when given the opportunity, listen. But if we're going to look at my bugbear, direct provision, are we hearing the stories of the people who are actually living in direct provision? Or are we hearing people arguing about it? And for the most part, we're not. There are some, and there's some great work going on. There's a great photographer who's documenting the lives of people in direct provision, and there's Our Table, which Mary Redmond is involved in. I know she's here, and these kind of initiatives. But we don't have enough of them. We need to be hearing from the people who are living in that crappy system and have been living in that crappy system for years on end, and kids who are growing up in it.
I think it's an excellent point, and I think maybe just to finish up is to say that it's about creating spaces for people like that to share their stories and giving people platforms to share their stories in the same way that
the Abbey Theatre
did for you, in the same way that the Hub does for us, and the events that we do when we had Colm Tobin in talking about a history of representations of same-sex experiences in literature and so on. That maybe the next thing, or what we have to do is stop telling these stories and actually do something in a way. But thank you very much, Rory, for coming along tonight.
Thank you.